Oh, we're back. Okay. And as Professor Freeman mentioned, I have a book coming out, hopefully, well, in next year, inshallah, as we say, God willing, next year, called The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. And much of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be based on some of the ideas in that book, and also taking in some of my scholarship. Okay, so first let's talk about the pre-9/11 era. Because if there's one thing that we all know is that the racialization of Muslims did not start on September 11th, and the multiple negative stereotypes about Muslims that fed into their racialization predate 9/11 in some cases by centuries. But what September 11th did was entrench many of these stereotypes and transition a racialization process into something that I argue is much more permanent, where now we have something called the construction of the racial Muslim, the social construction of the racial Muslim. Okay, so most people will say, Muslims are not a race. What are you talking about? And some people on the right will get extremely upset about even the idea of calling Muslims a race, and will say they're actually a religion. And literally speaking, that is correct. They are a religion. Muslims are members of a religion, and in fact, they're members of a religion that is the second largest religion in the world. It is 1.8 billion Muslims across the world, compared to 2.3 billion Christians and 1.1 billion Hindus. And then, of course, there are many other faiths, but those are the three largest faiths worldwide. And they're not that far behind the number of Christians worldwide. And just some very basics, by the way, for everyone who is practicing abiding by Ramadan Mubarak. We are now in the holy month of fasting, which is one of the tenets of Islam, where you do not drink or eat anything from sunrise until sunset. So the main pillars are the testimony of faith in one God, and that the Prophet is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last prophet. There are 5 daily prayers. There's the month of Ramadan every year, which is based on the lunar calendar. There's a requirement to give zakat, which is charity, and it is supposed to be 2.5% of the amount of money you have left over after spending on your expenses and the cost of your life. So it's not 2.5% of your income, it's 2.5% of the money you have left over after you've been able to cover you and your family's expenses. And then finally, there's the Hajj, which is Arabic for the pilgrimage to Mecca. And that is something that is mandatory, but only if you can afford it and you're able to go. So it is considered an honor to be able to go, and not all Muslims can afford to go. Now, in the United States, there are 3.26 million Muslims. There's a big debate. Pew Research Center has it at 3.5 million, but then there are other organizations that believe it's closer to 6 million. But whether it's 3 or 6 million, we're talking about no more than 1% of the population of the United States. The total population right now is about 328 million. The reason why that's important is because when you think about how much attention Muslims get in the media, usually through in a negative light or through a negative lens, you would be surprised to hear that they're only 1%. So quite a lot of attention, quite a lot of sometimes near obsession with Muslims, and yet they're only 1% of the US population. Okay, so for our purposes here, what I'd like to focus on right now is kind of 2 research questions, and this is what this is what animates my forthcoming book. So the first one is, how does the interaction between religion and race contribute to the social construction of race in America, and more specifically, the construction of what I call the racial Muslim? And second, which is more of a descriptive research question, which is, what are the material and dignitary consequences of this racialization of Muslim identity on the religious freedoms and civil rights of Muslims? In other words, the so what question. So even if you can convince us that, in fact, there has been this social construction of the racial Muslim, so what does that mean for Muslims? What does that mean for American society? Okay. So my thesis is that in the post-9/11 era, to be Muslim is not solely a religious identity. It has become the socially constructed racial identity rooted in social and political structures that treat Islam as a violent political ideology, not a religion. And its adherents are barbaric, uncivilized, disloyal terrorists. And it's important to focus on this violent political ideology because we are in a nation that privileges religious freedom and privileges the rights of particularly religious minorities, at least on paper, and even normatively. This is not a country that, for example, will tell other countries, yeah, we've never really cared about religious freedom, we've never really cared about religious minorities, and it's really part of our tradition and what we're proud of or what we don't really care much about to persecute religious minorities. To the contrary, this is the country that thinks it is the beacon of religious freedom, and it's no coincidence that the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause are in the very First Amendment of the US Constitution. So that's why it's even more paradoxical that you have this small religious minority, 1% of the US population, being so overtly and openly targeted and discriminated against by its own government and by large portions of the public in a country that claims to privilege religious freedom in its laws and in its norms. Okay, so there's three premises on which this is based. And the first is that whiteness plus Christianity is conflated into a single national identity of, quote, the real American. And this is something that impacts not just Muslims, it impacts people who are not white and people who are not Christian. But what often happens is in the race research, there isn't enough emphasis on how religion also racializes. And in the religious studies, there is not as much attention paid to how the social construction of race can infringe on the religious freedoms of minorities in particular. So when you think of hierarchies, and for example, I subscribe to Derek Bell, he's a critical legal race scholar. He has a theory called the black-white paradigm, where you have a racial hierarchy where whites are permanently at the top and blacks are permanently at the bottom, and then you have fluidity between that top and that bottom, and that's where you get a lot of movement among immigrants and the quest for being the model minority, the quest from trying to go from not quite white or in between white to fully white, because whiteness is also a social construction. For example, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, they weren't considered fully white in the early 20th century, and yet now very few people question their whiteness, but that wasn't always the case. And so even though legally they were raced as white, socially they were certainly not treated in the same way or with the same benefits and opportunities as someone who was, for example, Anglo-Saxon or originally from Northern Europe or Northwest Europe. The second premise is that international events affect the racialization of faith groups. So that's just as a general rule, as well as racial groups, but in different ways, sometimes to their advantage and other times to their detriment. So when you, for example, think of Japanese internment, you cannot disconnect that very racist event from World War II, from the conflict between the United States and Japan. And similarly, when you have the targeting of Iranian students, when they were swept up in immigration sweeps, when they were interrogated, some of them were deported in 1979, that was very much connected to the hostage crisis in Iran of the US Embassy. So, and that's not, I'm not stating that to justify the mistreatment, but simply to explain that what happens abroad has always affected the diasporic communities in the United States that are connected to that particular foreign country or a particular region, usually when there's a conflict with the United States. So that tends to be when it's to their detriment. And then if there's a good relationship, that can sometimes work to their benefit, particularly when there's immigration preferences. Finally, the third premise is that when you have this racialization process intersect with religion, the ultimate outcome is that they do not have the full panoply of religious freedom. And so, for example, when Muslims have to worry about their mosques being vandalized on a regular basis, particularly in the post-9/11 era, we had a spike right after 2001. We had a spike after the war with Iraq, after the US invaded Iraq. We had a spike during the 2015 presidential elections when Islamophobic rhetoric was skyrocketing, particularly among Republican candidates, including then presidential candidate Donald Trump. And each time you have this racialization of religion, in this case, for Muslims, it's this, again, reframing of the religion as a violent political ideology, meaning you take it out of the world of religion, you put it in the world of politics, which then makes it fair game for racialization, without having to recognize that, wait a minute, we're actually violating our own principles. We're acting very un-American. But if we can take them out, if we can racialize them, and in our minds see them not as a religion, but as a violent political ideology, then we don't feel like hypocrites. Then we can still go to court and argue that Christians should be able to deny same-sex marriage couples build a marriage certificate, or building or making a cake, because that's their religious freedom principles. We can still defend the person in the local government that refuses to issue a marriage certificate to a same-sex couple based on her religious principles, and so on. Because oftentimes the people who tend to find the Islamophobic anti-Muslim rhetoric most salient are frequently also the same people within these groups that believe that religion is under siege and that Christians are under siege by the secular elites. And so they're very much about religious freedom, and they support it adamantly, including, for example, in the debates on abortion. And so there is this very obvious contradiction, and this book attempts to explain that in part, at least when it comes to Muslims. Okay. So another question is, well, if you're a religious or racial minority, does it matter whether you're a minority, and aren't you going to be treated poorly no matter what? So if you have a very cynical view of US history in particular, perhaps, but again, kind of going back to my original thesis or some of my premises, when you are a religious minority, one that is accepted as a religion, as a religious minority, you might have pictures that I put up some pictures of how you're portrayed. So here you have these three women, two of them are ostensibly Muslim, the third one is probably Muslim as well, because not all Muslim women wear a headscarf, and they're laughing and they seem very normal, and it's very unthreatening. And those would be the types of images that you may have, is that, oh, okay, they're wearing a headscarf, so what, that's just something on the side, as opposed to this picture where this woman is completely covered up and she looks, I mean, I'm thinking most Americans see this and go, oh my God, she must be oppressed, she must be miserable, maybe she's a terrorist, maybe her family members are terrorists, but we don't know anything about her. And that's the only image we're going to see of any Muslim, and not even realizing that simply because someone wears a burqa doesn't mean they're necessarily oppressed. Some of them have PhDs, and doesn't necessarily mean that they support terrorism. But again, the imaging matters. And so the first one I would argue is more along the lines of a protected religious minority, or more normalized, whereas the second picture would be more of this racialization phenomena where, oh, they're different, right? They're these racial others. Similarly, here you have a picture of a man praying. Well, that seems very benign, and that seems something that Muslims pray, Christians pray, that's great. And this is a Christian-dominated society, so to compare anything to Christianity is usually something good if you're comparing it as similar. Whereas if you have these images, then you're associating Muslim men with terrorism, with crime. We see the same types of usage of media and usage of images to stereotype African Americans, Asians, all kinds of racial minorities. But again, the question here is, if you are a religious minority, will you be at least less discriminated against, will you be more tolerated than if you are a racial minority, because of America's checkered history with racism, as opposed to its identity of being a bastion of religious freedom? Let's go to the next. Okay, so here's an example of where I think race and religion do make a difference in how, if you are a race, you are going to be more likely, or if you're a minority race, more likely to be discriminated against and more likely for it to be acceptable, as opposed to if you're a religious minority, you will be, it's not guaranteed, of course, but you will be more likely to be protected as a religious minority. So with race, this is the history of race in the United States. African enslavement, Native American genocide, right? The Native Americans, we took their land. We essentially engaged in what was otherwise a genocide. Similarly, all African Americans, their ancestors were brought here by force through slavery. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that was in effect for until 1943, that Chinese could not immigrate to the United States. And then also many Asians, including Chinese, couldn't naturalize, those who were already here couldn't naturalize starting in 1943 all the way up to 1954. Lynchings of African Americans was pervasive after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws were the norm across the entire South for most of the 20th century. It took a civil rights movement, near revolution, to get rid of it, to get rid of these laws. We had Japanese internment in World War II, and we now have, sorry, I'm just realizing I have it. And now we have mass incarceration, deportation, and institutionalized racism. So these things have not gone away, and African Americans, Latinos, in Native Americans, and now we're starting to see even anti-Asian racism reemerge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But these things are not going away, and being a racial minority as a group tends to lead to subordination. Now, there's always individual exceptions, and there's always individuals trying to not be treated like the rest of the group. And that's where you have a lot of identity performances of trying to assimilate as much as possible to be accepted by the dominant group. But as a group, you're still facing a lot of subordination. Now, contrast that with religion. This is the foundation of the US, is you've got the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came here, and the images in the history books as they came, they were fleeing persecution, they were the good people, and they came and they just wanted freedom, and they just wanted liberty, and they didn't want to hurt anyone, and they just wanted to have the freedom to practice their faith and not be oppressed. And as a result of the environment, you had exponential growth of Protestant denominations. So in fact, there were many, many varieties of Protestantism that could grow and that could develop in the United States that probably wouldn't have been able to happen in Europe, where you had much more or stronger control by the church, whether it was a Catholic church or whether it was a Protestant church. You had Christian schools that were built and universities, many of which still exist, although they're still of Christian backgrounds or Christian origins, they now are open to anyone. But the point is, there's a long tradition of protecting and creating these religious communities. And then, as I stated before, you have the First Amendment that protects the free exercise clause and effectively accommodates religious minorities in terms of their dress, their food, not having to engage in certain activities. Obviously, there's limits, but the fact that we accommodate them legally is extremely important. And also, and you don't see the same thing with race. Race is more of a defensive. Anti-racism laws or anti-discrimination laws is when there is to defend against racism, whereas accommodation is much more affirmative, where let's provide that space and let's give them the ability to be themselves and not have to assimilate to mainstream society. And also you have the Establishment Clause, which ensures that the government doesn't favor or disfavor a particular religion and doesn't use the power of the purse or doesn't use the law to do so. Now, again, I'm not stating that this in fact or in reality is necessarily what happens, but it's important that this is the law, and that when people go to challenge their religious freedom rights, they have a lot of legal tools. And then you also have the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act of 1993 and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And again, each of these laws makes the makes it easier or boosts the claims of plaintiffs or institutions who are alleging that the state or private actors are discriminating against them. So with the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, for example, that's the statute in which many of the mosques were able to file civil rights suits against local governments when they refused to give them a license to build a new mosque or the license to expand and renovate their mosques on all sorts of pretextual reasons, such as there's too much traffic, or there'll be too much noise, or this isn't the right place for a house of worship. And it became quite a serious problem for many Muslims across the country after 2001, because as Muslim communities were growing, they needed more mosques, and they had a very hard time building them because these local communities were just refusing them the zoning permits. And in some cases, Muslims had to go buy a church and then convert it into a mosque, because then they didn't have to go through the zoning authorities. But the point is that this law allows them to sue if they can prove that in fact these are all pretextual reasons. Similarly, prisoners, Muslims who are in prison or other minority or other religious minorities can use RLUIPA to file claims in order to make sure that the prisons accommodate their religious beliefs, that they have access to a Quran, that they can pray the Friday prayer, that they eat only halal meat, and so on. So again, when you look at these two, it is a stark difference, the history of race and the history of religion. I think with race, it's just much more obvious that this is a country that kind of shrugs when it's accused of being racist and accepts that, yeah, we have a pretty racist past. We're trying really hard not to be. But it's part of our history. Whereas I don't think the same thing applies to religious freedom. I think there's a lot more, if I would say, delusion when it comes to just how religiously free this country is for people who are not white Protestants. And I don't have time to go into the details of anti-Catholic bias and anti-Jew, anti-Semitism, which many of you in the audience may be familiar with, but that was also part of the racialization of Jews and Irish and Italians, and the fact that they were Catholic or Jewish played an important role in their own racialization. Okay, so what does it mean for a religion to be racialized? Well, in this case, essentially what happens is a person's Islamic beliefs or their dress or their conduct impute inferior biological traits that are historically used to describe African American, or African slaves, Native Americans, and Chinese immigrants. And then later, these same imputed inferior biological traits were also applied to Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the early 20th century. And it really wasn't until after World War II that the racialization of Jews, Mormons, and Catholics started to subside, primarily because of the Cold War required the United States to have to confront communism and show that we in the United States were not this godless people, and that in fact we treated we respected God, and we were a people of faith. And this is when "In God We Trust" got put in onto the dollar, and also added to the One Nation Under God, added to the Pledge of Allegiance. But a lot of it had to do, again, with international affairs and international events. And that ended up pushing the United States to be more tolerant of Jews, Catholics, and Mormons relative to its past. Again, I'm not claiming that there isn't anti-Semitism, there isn't anti-Catholic sentiment or anti-Mormon sentiment, but compared to 100 years ago, it's significantly, significantly less. Okay, so what are some of the things that, what are some of these imputed biological traits? Savage, and these are traits that are used not just with Muslims. So we're seeing these traits or these adjectives used now post 9/11 much more, but these were the same adjectives, pejorative of course, that were used to describe these other minority groups 100 years ago and more. Barbaric, unfit for self-governance, uncivilized, duplicitous, despotic, suspicious, foreign invaders. So these are, again, you're starting to see this trend, and in many ways that makes Muslims not very special, right? If you start to dig into the history of the US when it comes to racial minorities, and then you start looking at religious minorities, you see, okay, I'm starting to see something that's very common, the same types of inferiorization. And then, but that being said, each person or each group is unique in how it is racialized. And so when you're looking at the racialization of Islam as a violent political ideology, that's when you start looking, you got to go a little farther into the past and have a long view of the last 200 years, at least since the founding of the United States. And you'll see that there are different types of events, historical events, contemporary events, both domestic and international, that converge to produce this the racial Muslim. So you can go back as far as the Crusades, and so much of the anti-Muslim sentiment is rooted in theological rhetoric, and you'll see that with the far right in the United States. And I think that's one of the reasons why Islamophobia can be very appealing to some far right evangelical groups. The Barbary Wars, which was the first time that the US had a conflict with a Muslim majority country, and this was effectively, in a nutshell, there were the Barbary countries were what was current day Libya, Algeria, and Morocco. And one of the ways that they made money is they had pirates who would capture European ships and enslave the white crew until their king or their crowns would pay ransom to free them. Until then, they were treated very poorly, like most slaves are, and put into hard labor and in bad conditions. And of course, they would take everything in the ship. And ultimately what happened, the way that it got resolved is that there were treaties between the Barbary kings and Europe to say, if you pay us something every year, if you pay us a tribute, we will not capture your ships. When the US became independent, it was no longer protected by the British. And so what happens is they started capturing American ships, and the Americans refused to pay the tribute. And ultimately it turned into a series of wars. And during those wars, you had an entire genre of Barbary war genre where Muslims were portrayed as heathens, as savages, as violent, and much of what we see today, except in that time frame. And many Americans don't really know about this history, but it's deeply embedded in US history. And then, of course, you had the relationship with the Ottoman Empire, because it was essentially it controlled most of Muslim majority lands until World War I, when it was defeated and essentially split up by the British and the French into what are currently the modern day states in the United States. But the Turks were always viewed as these licentious, despotic, backward people by Europeans, and this was part of Orientalism. So if you read Edward Said's Orientalism, much of it discusses this, and that was then imported into the United States. And similarly, Mohammedans, which is what Muslims were called until recently, they were also viewed as violent. And you see this theme of Islam was spread by the sword, it was spread through violence, something that we see post 9/11 much more regularly. But this narrative has been around for many decades or many centuries. More recently, then you have Arab nationalism, Zionism, Palestinian liberation movements, in the 1973 oil crisis. And so all of these developments produced a very negative portrayal of Arabs in particular. And again, this was based on international relations, the United States deciding that it was going to ally more with Israel than the Arab states, seeing Arab nationalism as a threat, similar to seeing Black nationalism as a threat domestically. And the Palestinians were not seen as a liberation movement, they were seen as terrorists. They were seen as illegitimate. And then the 1973 oil crisis, which was a major national crisis where you had lines of people in every city couldn't get gas, and blaming the Arabs. So there was all types of anti-Arab media. And then you also have, I'll go just frequently, over the last 30 years, the Iranian Revolution, the Marine barracks that were bombed in Lebanon, Black Hawk Down in Somalia. So many of you may not be familiar with these events, but these were big national events, and all of them happened in Muslim majority countries. And each time they happened, you had a stream of negative media that tended to be focused on, at least before, I would say the early 1990s, was focused much more on Arabs, or portrayed the Middle East as Arab Muslim. And then starting in the 1990s, when Osama bin Laden was no longer the Americans' friend that the American government was paying to fight the Russians in Afghanistan, once that turn happened, then you had Muslims being the primary negative stereotype. Okay, so all that just gets us, this is obviously very truncated, and my book will be much more elaborate on these details, but this is all just to tell you that 9/11 didn't just happen all of a sudden. There's a long history, right, of anti-Muslim bias. It takes different forms, and it has a different primary identity, from Mohammedan to Turk to Gulf Sheikh to Iranian to Palestinian, and then eventually to just the Muslim. And I think that's a big difference in the post 9/11 era. Okay, so there's something called, there's a theory or a concept called racial projects in critical race theory. And racial projects are usually government projects. So mass incarceration is a racial project that targets specifically African Americans. Jim Crow is a racial project. Immigration enforcement is a racial project, particularly focused on Latinos, and other communities as well. So there is a list of anti-Muslim racial projects that were implemented, adopted and implemented after September 11, 2001. And I've listed some of these. And so these are things that if you don't know much about, you can do more research. I've written about some of them in more depth. But for example, right after 9/11, there was something called the Absonder program. And that is where President Bush and Ashcroft, then the head of the Attorney General at the Department of Justice, essentially told DHS, or told immigration enforcement officials, DHS wasn't actually created until early 2003, that they need to focus all their immigration enforcement on Arabs and Muslims. And so they just started looking for anyone. First, they started with those who had been ordered deported, but they hadn't found, so they went looking for them. And then they started just arresting anyone that they thought even seemed a little suspicious. It ultimately ended up being racial and religious profiling, and it was very naked, religious and racial profiling. Many of them were put in prisons or in detention centers with criminals, and they were treated very poorly. They were abused by the prison guards and by other inmates. And there were suits that came out of that, such as Iqbal, such as Turkoman. So those were the lawsuits that ultimately went to Supreme Court. That was based on the Absonder program and these other programs that detained en masse many Muslim and Arabs immigrants. You had special registration of Muslim male non-immigrants. That was the infamous NSEERS. I have a piece called A Muslim Registry: the Precursor to Internment. If you want to know about the history of Muslim registration or special registration programs, they are very normal in the United States. We've had them for a long time, and they're completely legal under the Immigration Nationality Act, unfortunately. You have mass government surveillance of Muslim spaces. So many of you may have heard of the NYPD mass surveillance program. That's a anti-Muslim racial project, all in the name or under the guise of national security. And then, of course, you have informants and undercover agents that are actively engaged in sting operations, which continues until the present day. We suspect it's not as high in terms of the number of operations, but there's the FBI's money and its priorities are still in counterterrorism. And I'll talk later in this presentation about the post-pandemic era, because this is going to be a big question mark, is where will law enforcement's resources and attention go in light of this pandemic, and have we turned a corner from this post-9/11 counterterrorism age to now post-pandemic era, and what does that mean for Muslims and other minorities? Okay, material support to terrorism is the linchpin of investigating, arresting, detaining, and prosecuting and imprisoning Muslims. It's a very effective tool. Countering violent extremism is effectively a community policing program, or claims to be, but really a surveillance program in disguise. I've written a piece called Policing Terrorists in the Community, which goes a deep dive on that. And then most recently, you saw the exclusion of Syrian refugees in the Muslim ban. You saw the inclusion of Christians in other words, there was an exemption of Christian refugees with the Muslim ban. That was an interesting play and an interesting evidence that, well, we do offer religious freedom to Christians, even in the Muslim ban. Calls for special IDs for Muslim. Many of you may be too young to remember this, but right after 9/11, there was a call by many Republicans and conservatives that Muslims should be wearing special IDs after 9/11. And then finally, you have the infamous Muslim travel ban of 2017, which went all the way up to Supreme Court and was blessed by Supreme Court. Now, granted, it was more narrow than what Trump originally wanted, but the fact is the law is on the government side when it comes to immigration and national security practices that effectively target a religion or under the guise of national origin, right? So again, not saying, oh, this isn't about religion, this is really about national origin, which is a proxy for race. All right, I hope I still have all of you with me. And that then means that you get private discrimination because the private gets signals from the government. The government's actions legitimize or delegitimize certain private actions. And here are the list of private discrimination, forms of private discrimination, from anti-mosque campaigns, vandalization of mosques, burning of mosques, arson. You had the anti-Sharia campaign, which was effectively a way to say, if you practice Islam, you are a terrorist, you're not assimilated, you're a foreigner, and you're a threatening foreigner. And people, of course, don't know what Sharia is. It literally means Islamic law, but Islamic law is a jurisprudence, and it is a very complicated area of law. It is not something that can simply be just called Sharia law. There are different interpretations of Islamic law across the Middle East. There are 4 schools of thought within Sunnism. There's multiple schools of thought within Shiism. It's very complicated. But in a nutshell, what these people were doing is saying, if you are an abiding, adhering, practicing Muslim, then you probably follow Sharia, and Sharia means anti-American, it means terrorists, it means extremists. And so they dumbed it down to something very simple. And by the way, there is nothing in the law that allows someone to claim, well, let me say this, US law does not allow people to do certain things in the name of religion. So even if it were true that, for example, there are practices that are very, very outdated, rarely practiced in the Muslim majority countries, and actually they're prohibited, legally prohibited in Muslim majority countries, such as, say, stoning someone to death or cutting off someone's hand. In most Muslim majority countries, that's illegal. But even if someone were to come to a US court and say, well, my religion says I can do that, and cite something from 200 or 300 years ago, US courts are not going to accept that. You can't, that's not, religious accommodation does have its limits. So a lot of these arguments were red herrings and completely anachronistic and inapplicable. You had billboard campaigns that were defaming Islam, harassment of Muslims in the workplace. Many Muslim children were bullied. I recommend you check out the research of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ispu.org. They've done some good work on bullying. Assault of Muslim women wearing headscarves. And then, of course, you have Barack Hussein Obama, the secret Muslim. So that whole campaign of claiming that Obama was a secret Muslim was the convergence of anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim racism. Because America had gotten to a point, for better or worse, where being so openly anti-Black would create some very serious political consequences. However, you could still use dog whistle politics, or, which it still goes on, or you could you could identify them as another hated minority, but it's acceptable to hate that minority, and that would be Muslim. So it's okay to say that he's a Muslim, and everybody understands that's pejorative. Nobody's trying to hide that. But really, they're opposed to his Blackness because he wasn't Muslim. His dad was Muslim and was Kenyan, but he wasn't raised with his father, and he was raised as a Christian, and there was no question to that. But they couldn't call him the N-word, which is what they really meant, and so they called him a Muslim. Right? So that was another kind of convergence there. Okay, so let's take a look here at what caused much of this the private discrimination. This is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a great resource in keeping track of the rise of right-wing extremism in the United States and white nationalists and white extremists, alt-right, et cetera, which is a very troubling, growing threat. So even though the FBI is focused on Muslims, meanwhile, these white extremist groups are proliferating. And so you can see these numbers are going up very rapidly over a short period of time. And these groups are specifically anti-Muslim. Now, are they also probably anti-Black or anti-immigrant or anti-Semitic? Yes, but their primary focus is this obsession that Muslims are going to invade from within, that Muslims are a fifth column, that they're a threat to the United States. And these are just some of them. I've listed some of them, and you can go to the Southern Poverty Law Center to see them. Now, what made the Trump administration so dangerous for Muslims in particular, but dangerous on many fronts for other communities as well, is that he hired many people who were leaders in, the Center for Security Policy, I'm blanking on his name, but there are many other, well, Pompeo is well known for being an Islamophobe, and he's the head of the CIA. But he brought in many of these people who, at least during the Obama administration, were not given much credence. And although their popularity was growing significantly among the far right, they didn't have that much access to the executive branch. And so Trump gave them that access, and as a result, you have the Muslim ban, right? And you have and Muslim ban 2.0, and other things that go well beyond even just anti-Muslim racism, obviously. Okay. Here is a poll that, in case you all haven't seen this before, this is from the Pew Research Centers from 2014, and it's very telling in terms of the US public's feelings towards particular religions. And so the Jews, Catholics, and evangelical Christians is what the public feels warmest towards, meaning more familiar, less threatened, and Muslims and atheists are at the bottom. Less familiar, more threatening, not very comfortable with. And so that gives you some perspective on the limits of religious freedom, because if those feelings, those warm feelings versus cold feelings, are negative versus positive, if you see this big disparity, that's going to reflect how much religious freedom these groups are going to have, especially when it comes to private actors and even government actors. And the only benefit you have with the government actors is you can go to court and sue them, but it's going to take years, and many communities and individuals don't have those resources. So if the law is only enforced in the breach, it's not a very effective law, and your rights are relatively hollow. Here is another poll that is from YouGov of 2016. And so this also shows how Islamophobia falls along political partisan lines, and then explains why so many Trump supporters supported the Muslim ban, and why they will continue to support anything that's anti-Muslim. As you see, their opinion, so if they asked what's their view of Muslims as violent, the Trump supporters were the ones who extremely well, right? They believe Muslims as violent. Yes, the question is, how well does the word violent describe most Muslims? And so you have more than 40% saying extremely well of Trump supporters. And then as you go farther down, you can see it's the Democrats who say not well at all. But there is still some Islamophobia among Democrats and obviously among Republicans as well. And then this is a really interesting chart and informative chart from the Georgetown Bridge Initiative, another good resource for data and facts about Islamophobia. And this just shows how hate has a direct impact. It's very hard to prove in a court of law the causal connection, which is why it's hard to get a remedy in courts. But that doesn't mean that the causal connection isn't there. In other words, when you had this pre-election, or when you had this election season, the presidential election season, where Muslims were the primary punching bag and the Republicans were competing to see who could be more anti-Muslim, and Trump won the day, and as people who were Muslim, it was extremely traumatizing. It was just so ubiquitous and daily. And these are the hate crimes or hate incidences that were recorded by the Georgetown Bridge Initiative. And always remember that hate incidences or hate crimes are always underreported exponentially. But you just see the difference from 130 to 213. So if you just think of percentages, that's a high increase in percentage. And there are many other polls that show the same problem. Okay. And then finally, on the post-9/11 era, essentially this is what you have, is you have state action, and you have that legitimizes private action, and then you have this legitimization cycle. And so part of the challenge for civil rights and civil liberties advocates is to break that legitimization cycle. So both to stop the government from engaging in openly anti-Muslim discrimination and rhetoric and action, and also so that it doesn't egg on or give a green light to private actors, but also to stop the private actors and be active bystanders and sometimes sue them in civil court. And what we did see, one silver lining, and it took 16 years for it to happen, and some very extreme levels of Islamophobia, particularly in the public discourse, was the populist backlash against Islamophobia that was manifested most obviously or most saliently in the Muslim ban, the anti-Muslim ban protests in airports. So when you saw protests by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people in airports across the country in January 2017 and in February 2017, that was very promising. And I, as somebody who's been studying this issue for a long time, it was the first time I've seen non-Muslims come and protest with Muslims on these issues in large numbers. And that was a sign that Americans had finally woken up. Right after 2 years of the electioneering that was so anti-Muslim, I think Americans, particularly liberal Americans, realized we have a serious problem. This is becoming permanent, and this has started to really infect our country, and it is part of our race politics now. It is not a temporary issue. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the post-pandemic era. So in other words, you know, what I've described, you know, is a very abbreviated summary, but is a little bit in the pre-9/11, a lot post-9/11, and now what? You know, now we have this completely unexpected event, a national emergency, an international emergency, and it's a game changer on so many fronts, right? And there's webinars galore about COVID-19 and the pandemic, and what does this mean? How does it affect things domestically or nationally? So I want to ask the question of how it's going to affect anti-Muslim racism and Muslim communities in the US, and then also, you know, ask some other questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to, but I think they're worth asking, and hopefully with time we'll find out what those answers are. So the first is there is going to be a shift in US geopolitics. So, you know, if you look back at the discrimination of diasporic groups in the US, they tend to, again, as I stated early, tend to be correlated with major changes in geopolitics. So whether it was World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Iranian Islamic Revolution, the end of the Cold War, September 11th. So these are all kind of major events that then affect US foreign policy and then US domestic policies towards minorities. So the first, here's the 4 ways that I think you're going to have some shifts in US geopolitics. Now they're not exclusive, there's other shifts. But the first is this pivot to Asia, which Obama had started, but it really hadn't gone full pivot. And the pivot to Asia matters to Arabs and Muslims in the US is because since the end of the Cold War, it went from the pivot from Russia to the pivot to the Middle East, right? And so from 1991-92 all the way perhaps until today, or at least present day, we don't know yet, the focus of US geopolitics has been the Middle East in terms of the media, where we send our militaries, where we go to war, all of the propaganda in the media has been very much focused on majority countries, and as a result, the diaspora communities have paid a very high price for it. So now the question is, is the government going to start focusing on China? Right, the rise of China, we've noticed, has been happening for a while economically, but will it also translate into a much more adversarial relationship? You know, is there going to be a Cold War in the future? We don't know. But the pandemic, because of where it originated in terms of the beginning of COVID-19, because it coming from Wuhan province, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that affects Asians in the US, but that just gives more fuel to those who are looking for that new enemy to be China, right? Because the Middle East is pretty much broke. Al-Qaeda is very weak, ISIS is very weak, and the Arabs are all ruled by dictators that are completely obedient to the United States. So the region has been tamed. And the only two countries left that are not blindly obeying the US are Syria and Iran, which is why much of the focus has been on Iran. And so there's a very active attempt to try to crush Iran, but through the sanctions and through other means, which, as many of you know, has resulted in Iran not being able to get the medical equipment that it needs to fight the pandemic. So there's been some very deadly consequences to the US's intransigence and refusal to lift some of the sanctions for purposes of public health in Iran. So that just goes to show the cruelty of our country's policies when we dehumanize a people, and in this case that would be the Iranians. The other thing you'll see is the immigration. So related to that is the immigration restrictions directed at East Asia. So it'll be interesting to see if we're going to get to this reversal back to this anti-Asian perspective on immigration and how that's going to translate, how expansive that will be. Because thus far, the immigration has been open to India and China, seeing them as kind of these model immigrants that come and they're tech savvy and they're merit based. They come as students, they usually transfer status, adjust their status, etc. And then the bad immigrants are the Latino immigrants from Central America, and then the Muslim and Arab immigrants from the Middle East. And then of course the European immigrants are consistently always good because of the connection with whiteness. You'll also have public health as a pretext for border wall and refugee restrictions. We've already seen Trump close the border. He's categorically denying anyone asylum at the border, and he's just completely isolated the entire country based on this pandemic. Now, one could argue that at least with just closing the border, not with the refugee issue, because I do think that's something that can be managed without anyway, with regard to just closing the border, even if one can argue, for argument's sake, that it should be closed for a month, 2 months, what you're going to see is the continuation of that. And I think this pandemic is going to offer an opportunity for Trump to really push what he's always been trying to push in his anti-immigrant stance, particularly focusing on Central America. And then you're going to see a resurgence of anti-communism propaganda, because we're already, so the COVID-19 pandemic, and I've written about this in Al Jazeera, but with an op-ed called Stop Anti-Asian Racism Before It Is Normalized, is that right now the Republicans and Trump in particular and the far right have attempted, everybody's looking for a scapegoat, everybody's looking to blame someone. Religious or racial minorities in particular are usually the typical suspects, the usual suspects that are targeted. And when there was a pushback against, and there has been pushback against anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism, which there should be, what's happening is the Republicans are realizing, okay, you know what, let's just focus on China, the country, and then let's criticize them for being communists. And let's talk about their governance structure and the country itself, and then explain or be specific. We're not talking about Chinese people, because you're going to see more of that. But that's an interesting return of the Cold War rhetoric. So again, this pivot to Asia / pivot to China with the resurgence of anti-communism propaganda may result in a de-emphasis from the Muslim majority countries, and then an emphasis to China and East Asia in particular. Again, much of this is speculative, but I think it's plausible. Then you have the shift in domestic politics. And here's just some of the things that you should expect. You're going to have an increase in tracking and surveillance under the pretext of public health. And that's very dangerous terrain. We saw the same thing after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, where many of the surveillance authorities were expanded for the FBI, the NSA, the CIA. They're all it took lawsuits or Snowden's revelations for us to even learn of some of them. But when there's national emergencies, the government wants more power. They claim that it is for a rational, race-neutral reason, but then it becomes normalized. So just be very critical of any type of increased surveillance in the name of public health, because it can easily be either selectively targeting minorities from the very beginning, or it can start one way and turn ugly later. We already have very heightened border and transportation security measures as a result of 9/11, And now that there'll be an expansion, and then the question is, will infectious disease or public health be used as a pretext for profiling, right? Whomever, probably starting with people from China and East Asia and perhaps expanding to other groups. And then I think in a positive light, or something that I think is positive, is we are finally getting some more meaningful critical examinations of the harms of globalization, the inequities in our society, the extremes of our capitalist system. And so whether it's more people listening to Naomi Klein's shock doctrine and the book that she wrote, or people listening to other more progressive voices. Now, of course, we have Bernie Sanders to thank, and Elizabeth Warren and the elections of bringing a progressive voice more into the mainstream. But this pandemic has really just exposed these inequalities and made what Sanders and Warren were saying much more real, that it wasn't simply political, it wasn't politicking, it wasn't abstract propaganda. There are some very serious inequities that we're seeing now in our society due to the pandemic. Now, however, some things never change, right? And the first thing is that you will continue to see racial scapegoating during national emergencies. And as I just stated earlier, the Asians will be accused, and Chinese more specifically, but most people aren't going to know the difference between a Chinese and someone from East Asia, and whether they're an American citizen or not, whether they've been here 5 generations or not. And so there is already a rise in complaints of discrimination. There is a movement called Stop AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander Hate. So that's a hashtag. You can follow the news on that. And they've already tracked 1,100 complaints of discrimination since March 1st, 2020. And you should expect it to increase, particularly as states start to open up and people start going out in public, and particularly in areas where there isn't a large Asian American community. If post 9/11 is prologue and tells us what's going to happen, unfortunately, you're going to see many private citizens become collectively blamed. And so that's something we need to be very aware of and think creatively about how to protect people within those communities and how to nip that in the bud before it hurts too many people's lives. And then you have the Muslim spread COVID-19. So never miss an opportunity to be anti-Muslim, Trump. So he then puts this quote, this tweet that he retweets by some person named Paul Sperry, and he essentially says, let's see if authorities enforce the social distancing orders for mosques during Ramadan, like they did churches during Easter. Now, of course, the irony here is that it was the churches, well, not all of them, but some of them, that refused to close and gathered hundreds of people, and some of them had to be arrested in Florida because they refused to listen. Yet there was no evidence that mosques were violating the stay-at-home order. So one, the facts are completely flipped, but two, just another opportunity to give some red meat to his anti-immigrant and Islamophobic base. And then, of course, you have this phenomena where in the beginning, in March, every time many of the headlines that had nothing to do, this is a mosque in Turkey, or I mean, I don't know if it's the one in Turkey, as one looks very similar that I've been in Turkey, but this is a mosque. And those of us who've been in mosques, and the very nice mosques, we know that this looks like a mosque. And yet that's the picture that kept being used in all of these random headlines, right? This has nothing to do with prisons in California, right? This is a mosque in the Middle East somewhere or in Turkey. Again, these types of images are not accidental, and even if they are accidental, they reaffirm all of these pre-existing Islamophobic notions that have been percolating for 2 decades now. And something else that never changes is racialized public health. So as we're already seeing, is higher death rates of African American and Latino immigrants. Excuse me, not immigrants, Latinos. So this is just one graph from New York, because as you all know, New York is the epicenter. And so the numbers speak for themselves in terms of the comparisons between whites, Hispanics, and African Americans. And this is as of April 16th. So the numbers are, as you know, unfortunately higher each day. And then you have prisons and immigrant detention centers that are effectively extremely dangerous for, or make it very easy for the COVID-19 virus to spread. And there's been advocacy, some of it's effective, some not as effective, to release prisoners and at the very least release immigrant detainees until this pandemic is over, so that they can not be put themselves in circumstances they're not at risk. You have a disparate impact of the pandemic on low-income people for various reasons, from the physical environment to health and other factors. You'll have race. So 1 in 3 jobs by women are essential jobs during the pandemic, so that increases their exposure to becoming sick and getting the virus. Only 16% of Latinos can work from home, meaning that they're either going to become unemployed and fired, or they're essential workers and they have to go in to work. But again, this quarantine has a huge disparate impact on them just by nature of the types of jobs that are held within those communities. And only 19% of African American workers can work from home. So all of this is resulting in higher infection rates and higher deaths. I think in Chicago, the numbers are extremely disturbing, where something like 70% of the deaths in Chicago are of African Americans, but only 40% of the population in Chicago is African American. So these numbers are extremely shocking. Okay, so I'm about to wrap up, and so I will ask a few questions for thought. The first is, so what does this mean for the future of the racial status of Muslims in the United States? You know, are they going to be permanently racialized in light of this major shift that's forthcoming in geopolitics and domestic politics as a result of the pandemic? Can they go back to being model minorities, which was what many of them were, particularly the immigrants, before 9/11, or will they be permanently racialized? Now, with African American Muslims, they've always been racialized. My analysis of race politics and the intersection of race and religion is that if you are African American, you are Black first, and you are Black always. And if you are African American Muslim, then you are a particularly dangerous type of African American, right, or Black person. Islam in the civil rights movement, especially when you think of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, was associated with subversion. It was associated with Black nationalism, which of course for the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover were major national security threats as far as they were concerned. So Islam has always been, or African American Muslims have always been people who were particularly dangerous, right? Particularly susceptible to the criminal justice system, to being political prisoners, right? To being political targets in political trials. And that hasn't changed, and I don't think that's going to change. So one of the challenges of studying the racial Muslim is being able to show the overlap between African American Muslims and the experiences that they've had, and immigrant Muslims and the experiences they have. Much of what I talked about today with the pre-9/11 era was focused on immigrant Muslims, Orientalism, and these international events. And so I think with the immigrant Muslims, some of them still think that they can fight again. Those of you who don't know much about, or you don't know the categories in the US Census, it is highly relevant here that anyone from North Africa or the Middle East is white on the census. They are not non-white. So they are not included in diversity numbers. They're not included in any type of affirmative action for minorities or remedial action against discrimination. And because it's on the census, it's also in the federal, all of the boxes that you have to check when you go to school, etc., you check. And so some people, at least pre-9/11, convinced themselves, some Arabs in particular, would say, okay, well then I'm white, and let me just be white because there's privileges that come with that. But after 9/11, it was a rude awakening. And in fact, there were many Arab Americans who were Republicans before 9/11 and were proud to have contributed toward the election of President Bush in 2000, only to find him betray them and find the country turn on that identity group and Muslims writ large. So that's still a question that at play. And my answer is that they are permanently racialized. And I think that immigrant Muslims are now children of immigrants, whether you're originating from the Indian continent or you're originating from the Middle East, so non-sub-Saharan Africa, you are now, I don't think that you are going to be racialized as white in society. Now, how will Islamophobia affect religious freedom norms? How will foreign policy in the Middle East be affected by the pivot to Asia? I think these are really hard questions to answer. The last question is just something to think about when we look at the relationship between Iran and the US, and when we think about the potential marginalization of the Middle East in US geopolitics. The one thing that's going to keep the Middle East relevant is oil. That's going to keep it relevant. But if you think about the way the US was highly focused on Central America and South America in the 70s and the 80s, and as a result, was extremely interventionist in their politics and propped up many dictators. But now they're completely neglected, except of course with Maduro or with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because we can't have any communists, God forbid, controlling those countries. But generally they're quite neglected in our geopolitical focus. So there's a possibility that that will happen with the Middle East, and because of the shifting focus to China in particular. And then if that's the case, there is a possibility that then focus and scrutiny of Muslims originating from Muslim majority countries in the Middle East and North Africa may subside. I think that because of the 20 years of racialization, these groups are not, they will always be considered, or they will continue to be considered other. And one final thing I think is important to note is, and I wrote another piece called Evil with Muslim Americans' Human Rights Advocacy, and that's also on my SSRN page. There's a very, I think, promising and positive development within Muslim American communities or immigrant Muslim American communities, and by the generation that has now been born and raised in the United States. And that is they have started to become much more race conscious. They've started to address anti-Black racism within the Muslim community. They've started to ally with Latino immigrants and African American, like Black Lives Matter movement and African American rights movement, other progressive movements, in order to understanding that racial different groups, although in different ways, based on the same systemic institutionalized racial structures, whereas before 9/11, these immigrant communities were much more insulated and isolated and didn't really, to the extent that they were activists and progressive, it was very much focused on the international relations with their home countries. They were not as engaged in the domestic race politics. And so now immigrant Muslims or descendants of immigrant Muslims that are post-1965 have become much more entrenched in race politics. And I think that's a good thing. So in closing, here's just again, the SSRN page. If you want to read more, these are just some of my articles. And I will just end by putting a plug in for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, for which I serve as the director. It is the only U.S. Civil Rights Center, it's the only civil rights center in the U.S. law school that focuses on civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. So we're very excited to be trying to put into actions that I discussed today to be part of the solution, instead of simply just describing the problem. And we have a lecture series, which you can find on our YouTube channel, and and you can also get more information about it on this link. And we're doing a crowdfunding campaign in order to have our lecture series next year, which will be available to anyone virtually. So with that, I will end, and then I will cede the floor to Professor Freeman and anyone who has questions. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you so much. That was incredible. I'm just reeling from the amount of information that I got. And we have silent applause from the audience. And if you are my student and we're past our class time and you need to go, we totally understand. We will also take a few questions, and